My name is Harrison Rudolph. I'm an associate at the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law. I'd like to begin by extending a huge thank you to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus for coordinating this important briefing. Thank you. It means a lot. We're here to talk through the nuts and bolts of how Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, exploits detained children to target and deport their loved ones. This practice is as abominable as it sounds. So we're here to talk about ways to investigate, oversee, and stop it too. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our panel. We have Joanne Bautista, Policy Associate at the National Immigrant Justice Center, NIJC, who will introduce us to the Information Sharing Agreement entered into by DHS and HHS. With that, we're gonna, pardon my interruption. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Mukersel Powell, Democrat from Florida.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
Good morning. We had a Caucus meeting, talking about important things like saving our health care in America from the attacks. But thank you very much for having me here this morning, to the Hispanic Caucus, to the National Immigrant Justice Center, Georgetown Law Center on Privacy and Technology, and the Women's Refugee Commission for addressing the harms facing unaccompanied children and families as they come into the United States. In June 19th, it will be a year since the administration instituted this inhumane zero-tolerance policy of separating families. It is becoming more important than ever that we have these crucial discussions about the intersectionality of the administration's cruel policies. A lot of your discussion today will surround the implications and the concerns regarding information sharing agreements between the Department of Health and Human Services and HHS. Whether it is the negative consequences of information sharing when families are reunified, or the privacy concerns that arise, events like these are necessary because they remind us that an immigrant's journey doesn't necessarily end when they arrive into the United States. As you may know, last month I visited a child detention facility in Homestead, where HHS is holding more than 1,400 children between the ages of 13 and 17 years old. The government is calling this detention facility a shelter, but for me, it was a prison. Officials said that they were not allowed to talk to the children, but as I walked in, I am a mother, and seeing the faces of all these kids, I of course directly spoke with the children. I remember talking to one girl. I'm not going to forget this conversation. She was probably between 14 and 15 years old, and I asked her how long she had been there, and she told me she had been there for 9 months. And she told me that she had been separated from her mother at the border, and that her mother had been deported, and all she wanted was to be reunified with her mom. And another fact that I learned is that as these kids turn 18 at the detention facility, they are turned over to ICE, and many times in shackles. Our government is detaining these children as if they were criminals, and what we're seeing is that these kids and their families are fleeing violent conditions. They're fleeing, some of them, sexual violence, and I'm sure you all agree that these kids are not criminals. They are immigrants that are coming here in search of opportunities and finding their own American dream. And I know that, and I can relate to that story because I'm an immigrant myself. I came here when I was 14 years old. I came with my mom, she brought my sisters and I, knowing that we were not going to be able to have the opportunities in Ecuador that we would find here in this country. She worked very hard. She didn't learn no English. She went to school at nights and on the weekends, and I started working at the age of 15. But I realize and I know that my story is not unique, and I share this story with millions of Americans that live in this country who are working to achieve their own American dream. Unfortunately, we have an administration that is keeping these dreams from being realized. My experience at Homestead was extremely disturbing, but when I think about that experience, it strengthens my resolve to develop a smarter and more effective immigration system. There is a role of sharing information that plays into our immigration system so that we can have a more effective way of keeping track of the kids that are coming in through the border and their families. DHS and HHS each has a different tracking system for migrant children. In some cases, they're just rudimentary Word documents that were used to keep track of the kids. And I know this because I sat on Judiciary Committee and we did have a hearing on this issue. We can't allow these migrant children to get lost in the system because government agencies are not properly talking to each other. However, we cannot allow that information sharing to be weaponized and turned into a tool of terror. I want to leave you just with a quote that I thought about yesterday before coming here today. Immigration is not just a link to America's past, it's also a bridge to America's future. And those were some wise words from a former president, George Bush, Republican, when he signed into law the Immigration Act of 1990. As we continue to study immigration policies, I encourage you to keep in mind how immigration has made our country who we are today. Maybe some of you are immigrants like myself or your parents. Some of you are second or third or fourth generation. Your ancestors came to this country before we even knew it was the United States of America or it became the United States of America. And I know that all of you have your own personal story of how an immigrant has impacted you, your family, or your community. Immigrants are an important thread in our beautiful American tapestry. And so I thank you all for the work that you are doing to ensure that it remains that way. Thank you so much for having me this morning. Any questions? Or I have a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions. Okay, ready to do the work then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A huge thank you to Representative Powell for those powerful remarks. I'm told that we have Representative Berrigan sitting over there. So with that, it is my distinguished pleasure to introduce her. Thank you so very much.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I just wanted to come in and thank you all for the work that you all do day in and day out on this issue. What we're seeing happening at the border with children who are unaccompanied, who are being detained, is pretty reprehensible. And when we learned that the information that they were receiving from children was being used to deport their families and those people who are willing to come forward, it was pretty shocking to us that our government would be doing that. And we did recently have in the compromise bill language that was going to prevent the sharing of the information to not allow the deportations to continue. However, I don't trust the administration, to say the least, when they say they're not doing that. And I also don't think the exemption applies to sponsors that have any felony convictions or charges. And these days, we don't really know what they're using when they say charges. And so it's of concern to me, and certainly we need to continue to keep up the oversight, but also to make sure to codify long-term into law these provisions so that they cannot use this information. I mean, when I was at the border, I saw, actually when I was in the detention centers, I've done it all, at the border, I've slept at the concrete, I've been in the detention centers. We try to ask questions of ORR, which is the part that's overseen by HHS, and you could tell the reluctance in giving us any information at all, as though not wanting to give members of Congress the facts on what's really happening. And I think that is of concern. And when we were there, we heard different stories about, when a parent, when a child was going to talk to their parent and whether they were going to be available to speak to them, whether they came to the telephone. And recently, I actually heard that one of the parents who crossed over who presented themselves at the border for asylum and crossed over into U.S. territory was interviewed and interrogated, and she provided information about where some of her children were in the U.S. And within days, those children were rounded up and started into deportation proceedings. And this is exactly what is just unconscionable that we're doing, is we're taking this information and then using it. And what's happening, of course, is that children are staying in detention longer, and their families don't want to come forward because they're afraid that they themselves are going to be the subject of being deported. And so I just wanted to come in this morning to thank you all for your work on what you're doing to make sure we stop this practice long term, and that we provide real oversight. And so a lot of that really is coming from organizations and groups that are out there working together with staff to come up with the fixes. I know as a member of Congress, I often go to the groups and say, tell me what's happened on the ground. Let me know as much information as I can, because that's going to help me do a better job as a member. And then I can't do all the work because your staff is really the folks who do the details on making sure it doesn't happen again. And how do we get language drafted into a bill to making sure that we can get it passed. So, and I know that there's a lot of conversations happening right now about a comprehensive immigration reform bill and what's going to be in it. And we're putting that together as the Hispanic Caucus. So certainly if you have ideas, please make sure you send those on to us. And so with that, I just wanted to come and really thank you all for what you're doing and for having this conversation about the Memorandum of Understanding and about what is still not covered by the provision that we had in the compromise bill, and making sure that we're holding our members accountable, and frankly giving us the questions that we need when we have Secretary Nielsen come before us and when we have Secretary Azar come before us. He was before my Energy and Commerce Committee, and he thought it was perfectly fine what's happening down in Homestead, that the conditions were totally humane, that it was fine, and I hadn't been there firsthand, so I really didn't have the ability to come back at him like I did with Nielsen, but I hope to get down there at some time. But making sure that we're all working together on this issue. So just wanted to say thank you very much for your work, and I'm looking forward to this, to continue to work on this issue for some time to come.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Representative Berrigan. That was phenomenal. So with that, we're going to turn back to our panel. Closest to me, we have Joanne Bautista. Joanne is a policy associate at the National Immigrant Justice Center, NIJC. Joanne's going to introduce us to the information sharing agreement that we've been talking about that was entered into by DHS and HHS in 2018 that has led to the arrest of nearly 200 detained children's loved ones. We have Leah Chavla, policy advisor at the Women's Refugee Commission, who will describe the harms, including the serious chilling effects caused by this agreement. We have Alvaro Bedoya, the founding director of the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law, who's going to be discussing the privacy harms caused by this agreement. And we have Heidi Altman, policy director at NIJC, who will discuss actions members of Congress can take today and going forward to ensure that these children and their families are protected. With that, let's start to Joanne.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for being here today. So I'm going to take everyone on a brief overview of the history of the 2018 Memorandum of Agreement between the Department of Homeland Security
and the Department of Health and Human Services. This is going to be a lot of information, so we are here for a question and answer session at the end, so everyone just buckle up. So in April of 2018, CBP and ICE, so under the Department of Homeland Security, entered into an agreement with the Office of Refugee and Resettlement under the Department of Health and Human Services. So under this agreement, it was agreed upon that these three agencies were going to engage into continuous information sharing. From the time that an unaccompanied child is referred by CBP and ICE to ORR, while the child is in ORR custody, and even after the kid is released from ORR custody. So, this is very problematic, especially when it comes to the reunification process, because under the Memorandum of Agreement, ORR was then taking information provided by the child, so the name and addresses of potential sponsors, so usually these were family members, so it was information about the potential sponsors and adult household members, and ORR was also taking any documents and fingerprints and taking all of that and giving it to ICE. Additionally, ICE was then doing background checks on immigration and criminal history status, and then taking all of that information and sharing it with ORR. And then ORR was taking that information to determine whether a sponsor was going to be suitable enough to take in a child. So this memorandum changed the way the reunification process was being done. So in the past, ORR wasn't collecting fingerprints from potential sponsors, which was typically, like I mentioned before, a parent or legal guardian. Unless there was a documented risk to the child, and I think maybe a couple other exceptions. But not only was that different, but DHS was now getting involved in the reunification process, where historically that responsibility rested with the Office of Refugee and Resettlement as the experts for how to interact with unaccompanied kids and to know what their needs were a lot better than ICE. So in May and June, so about a couple months after the agreement was entered into, DHS said, okay, now that we have this agreement between all of us, we're actually going to make it worse and implement these regulations, which then would implement the Memorandum of Agreement, which meant essentially that the information that was being provided by these kids to HHS was then going to be used to detain and deport potential sponsors, so family members, pretty much. And not only that, but information gathered from these background checks and all of that was going to be entered into a database that was run by ICE. So ORR went from being a child welfare agency to essentially becoming another enforcement mechanism for ICE to use. And then additionally, ORR required all potential sponsors and all adult household members to be fingerprinted as well. So fast forward a couple more months, and we're looking at December 2018, when ORR decided to modify the initial Memorandum of Agreement. So ORR said, okay, we're actually going to limit the application of the memorandum in reference to the adult household members living with a potential sponsor. So what happened was that DHS was still going to be running these background checks and immigration, so involving criminal history and immigration history they were still going to do it for all the potential sponsors, but now they were only going to do it for some of the adult household members living with the potential sponsors. And there were like 3 instances where they could run these background checks for the household members living with the sponsor. But DHS was still going to take all that information and send it back to ORR for them to use. ORR was still going to be running their own background checks, and they were going to be making all potential sponsors and adult household members undergo public records checks and sex offender registry checks. But even with the change in December of 2018, the continuous information sharing was still happening, and that information was still being put into ICE's database. All right, so let's move to 2019, and I'm going to talk about the DHS provision in FY19 spending bill. So as Congresswoman Barragan mentioned, there's some great stuff in there related to DHS. So the good part of that provision is the limitation that it imposes. So essentially, ICE can't use money to detain and deport potential sponsors based on information obtained from kids, which was then given to HHS. However, there are still a lot of harms left. So under the DHS provision, there are broad exceptions. So the good piece, the only limitation that's in the provision, doesn't apply where a potential sponsor has a pending criminal charge. Not adjudicated, it's pending. And that is enough for ICE to then take enforcement action against a potential sponsor. So the spending bill also didn't get rid of the Memorandum of Agreement. So there's still this continuous information sharing happening. And again, the database still exists. So as of last Friday, a couple days ago, there was another revision made to the Memorandum of Agreement. So ORR said, okay, now we're actually not going to require any fingerprints at all from a parent or legal guardian who's trying to become a sponsor for a kid. But there are exceptions, of course. And in addition to getting rid of the fingerprint requirement, they were going to have case managers who are individuals who play critical roles in the reunification process continue to document a sponsor's immigration status. And in order to do that, they were going to require that all potential sponsors submit various forms of documentation, including documents to prove immigration status, so proof of a valid visa or of a legal permanent resident card, anything like that. Proof that they are a U.S. citizen, so birth certificates, naturalization certificates, stuff like that. And then a verification of whether or not the sponsor has a case with an immigration court, so whether they are in removal proceedings. But essentially, bottom line, the information sharing is still happening. That information is still being swapped back and forth, and this database is still in existence. So that's where we're at right now. But like I said, there'll be more opportunity to ask questions because that was a very quick overview. But thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Next we have Leah Chavla.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming this morning. Thank you, Harrison. Thank you, Joanne, for that wonderful introduction. So as Harrison mentioned, my name is Leah Chavla. I work at the Women's Refugee Commission. We are a research and policy advocacy organization. My program is based here in DC, although I have colleagues who work all over the world. And our mission is to protect the rights of refugee women, children, and families. So together with NAJC, Women's Refugee Commission, together, we conducted a survey of people, of care providers, of attorneys who work with unaccompanied children in order to examine the impacts of this MOA. And so a couple just quick notes. In terms of the most recent changes, this survey does not address those. So it does not include that December change that Joanne had mentioned. Nonetheless, I still think it's very important and has a lot of really great information that I think carries over today as that information is still being shared. And so I think that there's still consequences and fears stemming from that. So I'll just get into quickly a snapshot of the survey, and actually I think you all should have a copy of this, but if not, this is the survey I'm referring to, so it has more results, charts, and greater information. I'm happy to talk more about that later. So just as a quick snapshot of who participated in the survey, there were 47 individuals who participated, and these are people who work with children all the time. So we're talking about people who have a vast experience and expertise in working with children. Participants came from 20 states across the United States, so this is a systemic view, nationwide view. And all of the participants at least work with 1 to 10 potential sponsors, or family members of children a month. Unfortunately, I think the results were not surprising. They're kind of what we expected, but it's good to have this documented. So the vast majority of the participants, 75%, were aware of potential sponsors deciding not to come forward or to withdraw from the process, the sponsor vetting process, due to fear of the MOA. Almost half of the survey participants knew of specific instances in which ICE had initiated immigration enforcement against a potential sponsor that they believed could have derived from information sharing. According to the survey participants, in their experience, they observed that the MOA led to greater length of stay for children in care. Obviously, we know that this has profound implications and consequences on children, not only in their physical and mental health, but also in their ability to develop their case, work with their parents to get evidence, to have the emotional support that they need while they're pursuing their immigration case and ultimately relief. The survey participants also found that children who may be fearful of disclosure of information due to the perceived lack or lack thereof of confidentiality may also withhold critical information to keeping they themselves safe, or that may have an impact on their eligibility for certain types of legal relief. And then I think the last sort of final major conclusion, major finding, the biggest drop that the survey participants noted in terms of which category of sponsor was most affected were those that ORR refers to as Category 2 sponsors. So this would be like brother, sister, aunt, uncle, first cousin, grandparents. Although I should note that parents and legal guardians, which are Category 1 sponsors, were also affected, but I think the most pronounced was what they observed with Category 2 sponsors. And I think that this is important to note because ORR tries to place children in an order of preference. So parents and legal guardians would be first, then you move to brothers, sisters, right, close family relatives. And so if you're seeing a drop in close family relatives, then naturally that means that the next up is more distant connections like family friends, or people the children may not have met, right? And so this places children at a greater risk of harm post-release because you're essentially placing them with less suitable, but more distant connections. I had the opportunity to go to 2 shelters last week. The Women's Refugee Commission conducts a lot of monitoring of ORR facilities. I was in 2 facilities last week in Houston, and in fact, there they had a couple of cases of children who were separated from their parents, and one of the shelter personnel told me, the damage is done, right? Regardless of these changes in December, and I would even argue probably the one last week, right? The damage is done because sponsors are afraid of coming forward, and in this case it was the child's parent. The child knows that the parent is afraid to come forward, and so it's creating kind of a different type of family separation. I think that's it for me now, but I have obviously more information, more anecdotes from the people who work with these children that I think are really great, so maybe I'll get a chance later. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Next we have Alvaro Bedoya.
Thank you, Harrison. So when these kids arrive at the border, they undergo a series of interviews. They're asked questions by CBP, the Customs and Border Protection officers. They're asked questions by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And what I want to point out is that for years before this administration, the adults that conduct those interviews have understood that they're putting these kids in an impossible position. These kids have been traveling for hundreds of miles, often alone or in the company of strangers. Many of them die along the way, the ones who make it. Many of them have been sexually assaulted. And suddenly they're in the company of an adult, and that adult asks them this question: do you have any other close family members who live in the U.S.? And that adult explains that this is not to deport those people, right? This is to help you be reunited with them. This is a child. This is a child who has not seen their close family members for a very long time and has just experienced a very serious trauma. And so let me read to you an account from one of these translators about what goes through these kids' heads, because these kids are smart and they understand what's happening. And this is from Valeria Luiselli's book called Tell Me How It Ends. Do you have any other close family members who live in the U.S.? Immigration status, these are questions. The immigration status of family members is almost always undocumented. This, of course, means that presenting themselves in court in the company of a sponsor exposes other members of their family to a system that they have been dodging sometimes for decades. This guilt weighs on some children noticeably. Many ask during their interviews if their guardians will now be at risk for deportation. Sponsors have to give all their details when the children are screened, from their names to their exact addresses. They suddenly find themselves in a position of utter vulnerability. And yet thousands of children and their sponsors have presented themselves in court since the surge began. She was talking about the previous entry of a lot of these kids into the country. And so when ICE goes out and uses that information to find, arrest, and deport those sponsors, it doesn't just scare away the sponsors. It doesn't just increase through the roof the number of kids that are staying in detention, where they again are abused, where they again are psychologically traumatized. It doesn't just leave more kids away from their loved ones. It also re-traumatizes the children, because they now understand that it is because of them that their family members are being deported. And this is not like, it's really easy. I'm a former Hill staffer. It's really easy to look at this in terms of policy and these big words, right? These are kids that know they just deported their parents, basically, or deported their aunt or uncle. Over there on that table is a letter, and there's a lot of really important documents. This one summarizes a lot of the things you're gonna read, and it's from 112 organizations, faith organizations, immigrant rights organizations, privacy organizations, etc. It has a couple cases that drive this home. A 7-year-old child fled Honduras after his father was murdered and his mother abandoned him. His uncle came forward and took him in. ICE agents came to their home claiming that they were checking on the child. With the child watching, the agents arrested the uncle and subsequently placed him in removal proceedings. A teenager from Guatemala arrived alone at the Arizona border. He told ORR officials to contact his brother, a husband and father of 2 young children, I think it was 5 and 7 years old, who were living in New Mexico. ORR officials asked the brother for a range of information and told him it would not be used against him. Soon after the teen arrived in the home, ICE came and arrested his brother. And the teen now holds himself responsible for his brother's arrest. And if you read the underlying report, the 5 and 7-year-old aren't sleeping, they're not eating. This is what happens when ICE does this. And when ORR has shared this information with that understanding with ICE. I want to close with just a thought. So we are the Georgetown Law Center on Privacy and Technology. We care a lot about privacy. We also care about civil rights, like free press. Sandy Fulton is right there, like the Brennan Center for Justice. I think Rachel Levinson-Waldman's here. We are organizations that care about civil rights, but also care about privacy. Why privacy, right? Privacy isn't just about, cookies on your browser or your credit card information being hacked in a data breach. Privacy is about whether the government thinks it needs to treat you with dignity, and whether the government thinks it needs to treat the most sensitive information you can possibly give and protect it, right? Or whether they think they can use it against you to deport your family. And in this letter, the last paragraph is often missed because it's a 2.5-page letter. This is what these organizations are saying. American history is marked by notorious instances where vulnerable people gave sensitive information in trust to our government, only to have it used against them. In the 1940s, the U.S. government promised Japanese Americans that their census data would be used only for the census. Our government then used that data to find and incarcerate them in internment camps. In the 1970s, LGBT service members turn to military chaplains, physicians, and psychologists for help. These are gay and lesbian and queer folks who are reaching out in confidence to their chaplains because at the time it was illegal to be gay or lesbian and in the military. Those officials then use that information to out them and kick them out of the military. Those actions too were justified by specious claims of security. We now understand them to be abuses of vulnerable people. And if you look at the signers of this list, this includes the Japanese American Citizens League, the Japanese American Service Committee, the Fred Korematsu Center for Law and Equality. This is the historical context of what's going on here. This is that historical context, and it's so easy to lose sight of the horror of this because it's got lots of acronyms: ORR, ICE, information sharing, data agreements, etc., memorandum of understanding. This is the most basic and brutal violation of trust you can imagine. And I'm going to turn it over. Well, Harrison, you're going to turn it over to Heidi, but let me just note. Right now, we had a great letter led by Representative Jayapal that mentioned this but didn't actually ask any questions about it. We have had administration officials come before the House of Representatives several times. To our knowledge, no member of the House of Representatives has yet to actually directly ask a member of this administration how on earth they can do this. And so that is what we need. We need direct confrontation of these administration officials to call them out on what's happening. Understandably, if you're working for a member here, your members have had other things. There have been kids in cages, right? So there's other urgent things that are absolute horrors happening, but we cannot let this one pass underneath the radar. Please.
Thank you, Al. Next one, please introduce Heidi Ullman.
Thanks, Harrison. Okay, thank you everyone so much for being here amidst what we know are really challenging schedules. So I'm gonna bring us home and give you all a list of things that you can bring back to your bosses to do. But I think in order to be able to kind of have that list make sense, I want to connect a couple dots, right? So I'm going to ask you to do something that I think is kind of hard, but I think that probably everybody sitting in this room has a child in your life that you love. Maybe it's your own child, maybe it's your niece or nephew or a cousin, but whoever it is. I want you to actually think about what it would take for you to tell that child to leave you and go find safety, right? So there's a lot of rhetoric coming out of this administration that blames the kids, blames the parents, but in fact, a Central American mom isn't any different than me in terms of how much that mom loves her kid, right? I promise you that. I've talked to a lot of them. And so what's driving these kids showing up on our border is really horrific violence, pretty unimaginable, I would guess, to most of us. So if you think of that child you love alone, arriving at another country trying to find safety and aware that there's a relative somewhere in that country who could nurture them and shelter them and love them, the most important thing is getting that child to that person, right? Getting that child to safety. And it used to be that the agency that was in charge of making that happen was an agency with a child welfare focused mission. Health and Human Services, and within that agency, the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Suddenly we have immigration enforcement agents, deportation officers mucking around with that reunification process. And it's literally messing everything up. So how is it messing everything up, right? To connect all these dots, it is delaying by, we can't exaggerate how much, and this survey I think is really helpful on this point. It is delaying kids' reunification. Kids are staying in government custody longer, despite the fact that someone who loves them is in the United States waiting to care for them. Because of that, the number of kids in ORR custody has ballooned, not because more are arriving, but because they're staying longer, because the government is keeping them in custody longer, and because of that, ORR has turned to using shameful, unlicensed facilities like the Homestead facility that you heard two congresswomen speak about at the beginning of this session to hold these kids. How many of you heard about the Tornillo tent camp over the summer? That was the precursor to Homestead. That was a facility that was in use, and then Homestead opened up and kind of took it over at the same time. And then the last consequence is that because kids are staying in longer and because ORR is overwhelmed, there is not enough planning being done to help support kids when they turn 18, and rather than being supported in the community, they're being shuttled straight into ICE jails. And let me tell you, because I've met with them, seeing an 18-year-old kid straight out of an ORR shelter sitting in a private prison, totally baffled as to what on earth just happened. This was your 18th birthday present. It's deeply, deeply tragic that this is happening in our country. So your bosses are going to take action. Here's what we're going to ask them to do. I'm going to name 3 goals and then action steps. Our policy asks in the letter that Alvaro mentioned, I think, and across all of our coalitions, is that this memorandum of agreement that requires information sharing be terminated, and it can't happen too soon, number 1. Number 2, that Homestead be shut down. That also can't happen too soon. Kids are suffering. And number 3, ORR should never be using facilities like Homestead that are not state licensed to care for vulnerable children, period. Okay, so those are the 3 asks. So what can your bosses do? In terms of long-term visioning, am I going too fast? What was the first one? I'm going to be like instant. Terminate the memorandum of agreement. Second one is we want to shut down Homestead. Oh, this is fun. I feel like I'm teaching it. Third one is ORR should never be using facilities that are not state licensed, okay, to shelter and care for unaccompanied children. It's not too much to ask. So how do we get there? Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz is going to shortly be reintroducing a bill that many of your bosses were probably co-sponsors on last session. It's going to be renamed this session the Families Not Facilities Act. This is a bill that we really encourage all your members to get on that mitigates many of the harms of the information sharing agreement. That's kind of long-term visioning, right? Because we don't expect this president to put his signature on a bill like that. So what can we do right now? So what happens on what do you all have to do by April 1st? Get in your appropriations asks, right? I figured everyone would be like super stressed about that. All right, well, you have to get in your appropriations asks by April 1st. There are several ways in which we think the FY20 DHS and Labor Age approps bills can address this issue, and we hope that with a lot of support behind these asks, we can actually see them become law. Okay, so on the Labor Age bill, we are hoping for language that actually precludes the use of funding for the Memorandum of Agreement. Full stop, right? Defund the Memorandum of Agreement through the Labor Age approps bill. A lot of our organizations have submitted language requests making that ask. If any of you or your bosses are interested in leading on that, please reach out to us. We have a lot of ideas for pressure levers there. On the DHS bill, we need the same language that was in the FY19 bill that Joanne asked, but we need to get rid of those exceptions. There's no reason there should ever be any exception to keeping the fingerprinting and sponsorship reunification process within ORR. ORR has all the tools it needs to take care of these kids, all the tools it needs to make connections to law enforcement agencies and child welfare agencies when it needs to. Immigration enforcement just plays no role here. So those exceptions are not only harmful, but also unnecessary. So we want that language, but we want to get rid of those exceptions in the DHS bill. And again, if any of your bosses are interested in leading on that, please reach out to us. There are some other appropriations asks that we're shopping around, including some provisions that kind of remind ICE and ICE on DHS and HHS on Labor Age that they need to actually be taking care of kids who turn 18 and not shuttling them right into ICE custody as the law actually requires. That's a place too where we're happy to talk to you if you have ideas, if you're interested in working on it. So we've got Families Not Facilities, we've got approps, and the last thing I would just say is we just need more voices on this, right? So as Alvaro said, if your boss sits on a committee of jurisdiction here, an authorizing committee, there are hearings coming up. We can give you language. Reach out to us. We need questions to be asked of these administration officials, but also just like get out there on social media and call for an end to a termination to this memorandum of agreement, right? It's great to have so many voices talking about Homestead, but every time we talk about Homestead, we need to also be talking about how we need to terminate the information sharing agreement that made an atrocity like Homestead possible. right? So if your comms team wants to reach out to us, we'd love to support social media, 1 minute on the floor, any kind of public statements on this. So that was a lot, right? But I think that brings a close.
Can I add one resource? On this back table over there, we have compiled stories of actual children and their families who have been affected by this use of the kids' information and the sponsors' information. If you're from Arizona, if your boss is from Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Maryland, Missouri, New Mexico, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Texas, Virginia, and Washington, it has stories from your states, okay, that you can use that are all public. It actually has other stories that are unaffiliated with the state, and it'll give you the source. And then if you contact us, we can actually provide you a link because it's paper. Obviously, you can't click a hyperlink in paper. But that's all in the back, and Sabia was just holding the copies.
And Harrison's going to facilitate us through Q&A.
Thank you so very much, Heidi. Before we move into Q&A, I know that today's event was open to press. Is there any press in the room? Doesn't look like there is. Okay, we were going to ask for Q&A to possibly be off the record. Doesn't seem like that's a problem. I had a question prepared. I was going to ask about the language that had been enacted, but Heidi already answered it. So we can hopefully jump right into Q&A with folks in the room. So does anybody have any questions for the panel? Got one right here.
Yeah.
If you could state your name and affiliation.
Sure, Simon Sandoval, Motionburg Legal Aid Justice Center in Virginia. So the February appropriations language is obviously a really great step forward. It has some vagueness in it. What is the best way for us to quickly get ICE's interpretation of what that actually means for them, and also how they're, whether or how they're following it? This is an agency that's somewhat infamous for spending money in ways that Congress tells them not to. They currently have more people detained than they're appropriated for, especially with regards to people with final removal orders. Are they interpreting this language as preventing them from moving against those people, or are they interpreting the language as allowing them to move against those people, et cetera?
Can I acknowledge, Simon, your role in this whole company?
Yes, Simon.
Simon acts as though he's just another person in the crowd, but is actually leading the litigation efforts against this policy. So acknowledgement and thanks to him for his work on that. So I think, I was going to ask for a show of hands, but there are hearings coming up in Appropriations Homeland, right? In Homeland Appropes over CBP today. CBP.
I think it got rescheduled.
Oh, did it?
Maybe I saw an email. Don't quote me on that.
CBP this week, ICE next week, DHS the following week, right? And so what we're really asking is that in the actual hearings and then in QFers and questions for the record, that very specific questions be asked of specifically Vitello, right, who's the ICE director, as to how he's interpreting that language. Whether there have been any acts of enforcement through detention, arrest, or the initiation of removal proceedings since that language was enacted, and if so, which of the specific exceptions ICE claims to be using to have made that enforcement action. So if your bosses sit on Homeland Appropes or Homeland or Judiciary, you'll have opportunities to be asking those questions, and we would really love to work with you on the specific language. And then, of course, hopefully sharing with folks like Simon who are litigating to be able to inform the work that they're doing. Yeah?
Any other questions?
That's
Looks like we have one here.
Hi, I'm Lauren with Georgetown Law. So I guess my question is, I think Leah brought this up, but it seems like this policy is harming children in that it's potentially getting them, forcing them to be placed in the households of more distant relatives. But it also seems like part of the justification for this policy might be safety of the children. So I was wondering if you were aware of more effective tactics for preventing that type of harm to children.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think ultimately this MOA is sort of leading to those perverse consequences. So it's saying it's very much has been grounded in the safety of the child, and we're going to use this information but in a way that protects that safety. But I think, as you've said, and as I tried to highlight, it's the exact opposite. The effect is the exact opposite that it's having on kids. So I think in line with what Heidi was recommending, this Memorandum of Agreement needs to be dissolved. it's absolutely not leading to children becoming more safe. And in fact, I think when ORR has made the policy reversals, especially in December, it said, very clearly that it found that, certain provisions of the MOA were not in fact leading to greater safety, like greater information that would be used to place the children in safer settings. And so I think that that's right on the point. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah. I think it's notable the agency themselves have admitted that.
And not only did they acknowledge that, like, hey, like having these requirements doesn't make the kid any safer, but they also acknowledge that, like, it's also slowing down the reunification process, so kids are staying in ORR custody much longer.
I have a quick question. We've talked about the Tornillo tent city, which it sounded like folks in the room are familiar with. We talked about Homestead, and we talked about the MOA. Can we does someone want to talk a little bit about how those things are connected, if they are?
Yeah, I think really quick, because I think Heidi tried to address this when she spoke.
Yeah.
So because of all the additional requirements on information that ORR had to gather, right? So fingerprints of all sponsors, which it did have to in cases, not the parents, but in other cases, but then expanding that to household members, that really, I don't even tripled, whatever you want to say, the workload, right? And that really slowed things down. And so it led to this bottleneck of kids in custody, right, for those sponsors who are still willing to continue, because it took longer, there were a lot more documents to collect and things to process. So then that led to a lot more kids in custody, which then the network became saturated. ORR operates a network of shelters across the country. But at that point, because kids are staying longer, not because there were more kids coming, but because they're staying longer, there weren't enough beds to accommodate those kids that were recently being referred to ORR custody. This led to ORR saying, okay, well, we need to open up an emergency influx facility to accommodate these children, to have extra beds for the children. But I think as Heidi highlighted, because they're emergency facilities and because they said they had to set them up very quickly, they're not licensed. And I would highlight the fact that Homestead has been open for almost a year and it is unlicensed. And it continues to operate, and it has about over 1,600 children, the last that I was aware of. And I have reasons to believe that number is growing.
And just to add on to Homestead, it's the only for-profit facility that is housing unaccompanied kids. So there is a private corporation out there that is making money off of the kids being detained. It's very concerning.
Any other questions? Oh, right here. Were you? I don't mean.
I kind of do have a question. So the online detainee locator system is only for persons over the age of 18. So the only way that a sponsor would be able to find a child is if the child themselves disclosed the information. Is that correct?
Do you mind mentioning your name?
Oh, hi. Denise Velasquez, Congressman for the One Velas office.
Thank you.
So I guess my question again is kind of going off of what you guys had said about children having guilt because they had to disclose the information of their guardian or whoever it was that they were looking for. So there would be no way of the sponsor themselves knowing that the kid was in custody unless the child themselves disclosed it? Or how does this work? How does the sponsor find the child?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so there's ORR actually operates a hotline for sponsors of unaccompanied children, and we can circulate it, or you can go to their website. It's a 1-800 number where you can call in and try to find where your child is. Just to clarify the distinctions, the online locator that you mentioned is run and operated by ICE, and it is only for people, adults and families that are in the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So it's just a different system than the ORR system. We wouldn't ever advocate for something like the online locator to be publicly available because it's kids' information and because the locations of many of the shelters are kept confidential for the protection of the kids. But there is a mechanism. I think what you're getting at, though, is this really interesting question, and sometimes I think it gets confusing about the fact that actually, in the family separation context, the failure to share information caused a lot of harms, right? So you had families getting separated, DHS and HHS, DHS having custody of the parents, HHS having custody of the kids. no tracking mechanism, no planning for how to reunify, no ability for the two agencies to talk together and make sure that, like, for example, moms could have a chance to talk to their 9-year-old children on the phone. So in that case, there was a failure to share information when the agency was separating families. This is really separate from that, because in this case, it's like the flip, right? In this case, the agencies are sharing information between each other that they have no business sharing, and that there is no legitimate policy reason to be sharing except for the administration's enforcement-related agenda on the immigration side. So I have heard some folks kind of worry about whether the language in the FY19 approach bill precludes the kind of information sharing that needed to be happening during family separation, and I just want to make clear that it doesn't in any way. But are there any questions about that, about the different types of information sharing that we're talking about here? It's pretty clear. Does that answer your question?
I have a quick thing to add, if I may.
Yeah, please.
So Denise, right?
Yes.
Just hearing your name and your boss's name reminded me of this. So Heidi outlined a few steps to try to shut down this information sharing agreement. One is the long-term co-sponsoring Families Not Facilities Act that Debbie Wasserman-Schultz is about to reintroduce. Second is that really strong appropriations language for Labor H and DHS. Third is oversight, actually confronting those administration members face-to-face in those hearings. Rosa DeLauro did a wonderful hearing, but it was with NGOs rather than administration members. Here's the other part of the oversight letters. Last year, your boss, Representative Vela, and Representative Rice, and then Ranking Member Thompson wrote a letter that prompted ICE to shut down one of the craziest systems that was about to roll out to basically do social media monitoring constantly of all immigrants and flag people for deportation. Those letters actually make a huge difference. And so we haven't had a single oversight letter that's focused solely on this or that's asked any questions about this in the House. And so, and you all are the ones that actually are paying the bills, right? And that have the power to stop this. And so the last things I'd say on letters are, consider, so it's one thing when the people who co-sign your checks, so those are all folks on the authorizing committee of Homeland Security, right? Let's say your boss has a background in healthcare. Let's say your boss is a doctor or a nurse, right? How powerful would it be to have people with a healthcare background writing a letter? We need a letter from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. That would be powerful, and that would make a difference. And finally, consider if you use the term information sharing agreement and memorandum of agreement, those are all words that, for people who don't know what they mean, sound good, right? Oh, I like information, I like agreements, Consider using pithier language to communicate what's going on. And so some folks in this coalition refer to it as using children as bait, right? The title of this session is How ICE Exploits children to Target Deportations. Make sure you use language that actually communicates just how nasty this thing is, in addition to talking about the MOA and ORR and ICE, etc. Yeah, I don't mean to tell you how to do your jobs, but just, yeah. We need letters.
Thank you for that great question. I think we have time for one more question in the room. Oh, did I see a hand? No. It looks like you want to ask something. Great. Of course.
I have just one last question. So this practice seems like it's really awful for the families impacted. But I'm wondering if you could speak about if there are any harms that occur to the potential sponsors, even if the action doesn't result in a deportation, or if the sponsors happen to have some sort of legal status.
Yeah, so that's a great question, thank you. I didn't get to cover a lot of the information from the survey, but actually in here in this report, there are a lot of really good, I think there's some anecdotes in here from folks who work with children and their families on the impacts that's had on families. So it can be really destabilizing to the family, and it puts family members in a lot of stress. So one quote is, we have had parents of children struggle to put their other children in danger in order to accept an unaccompanied minor. This is something that a family should never struggle with. The MOA has been detrimental to the reunification process, and it further places children in danger post-reunification. It's traumatic in and outside of ORR shelters. Other people describe the emotional toll it has on children, and then the fear that even if a child is reunified and the family is not, apprehended, the fear that children have in participating in normal activities, such as going to school, going outside to play on a playground, right? Like the fear of sort of leaving the home or the fear of future enforcement looms over that family. So, thanks.
And just to quickly add on to that, the survey also mentions how families up and disappear because they are so afraid that ICE is going to use the information that they have to go after them. So, 1 minute a family is there and the next they're out of the neighborhood because they're just so scared.
Thank you to our panel. If folks have any questions, contact information for myself as well as everyone on the panel was on a sheet of paper back there. Another big thanks to CHC for coordinating this event with us, and we look forward to working with you guys to stop this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Call us.